Welcome back to another edition of The Big Ben Show. I'm Ben Domenech, coming to you from Fox News in Washington, D.C., where today we are talking about the decline of faith in institutions, in each other, in our country, and more. We have some great guests on today. Pollster John Rogers is going to be with us, as well as David Zweig, who has a new book on COVID and the school shutdowns that happened, looking back at everything during that period. We have Dylan on the board. We have Christine, our producer, up in New York. And I want to talk to you today about the decline of friendship and neighborhood in America. John over at Cygnal, the national pollster, asked a question that is pretty disturbing that we'll get to soon about the decline of friendship motivated by the 2024 election. But I think it's actually part of something bigger, and that's a decline of faith in institutions, in each other, and in our country. And it is most severe, I hate to tell you, on one side of the political aisle. Bill Maher had a comment on this just the other day. Cut one.
This is a serious problem for Democrats. Less than 1 in 4 Democrats under 30 say they're proud to be an American. 54% say they're embarrassed by it. Embarrassed? Like America's your mom picking you up at school? You're embarrassed to be an American? Well, guess what? The feeling's mutual. Because you have no perspective. Is America perfect? No, of course not. No country is.
He went on to say, if the thought leaders in the Democratic Party keep encouraging and not rebuking the idea that America is cringe and the people who run Gaza are great, the Democrats are doomed. I'll go even a step further. I think that we are actually doomed as a nation if we continue to see these kind of divides persist. If you have one political coalition on the left that has an enormous portion of its loudest voices embracing the idea that it's a bad thing to be American, there's only going to be worse and worse situations for you going forward, and the ability to be friends and neighbors across political lines will disappear. As if trying to prove Maher's point, here is a Daily Show correspondent, Ronnie Chang, cut 6.
I feel like I've been spending most of my life trying to get to America, to be very honest. Yeah, and it's just weird. It's a weird time to do it because the things that attracted me to America were, it was Back to the Future. It was Seinfeld. It was Michael Jordan. It wasn't the Iraq War. Right. So it's weird to join. It's like you're joining this empire, this evil empire, but that's not why you joined it for. It just so happened the evil empire had some really nice TV shows, and they do stand-up comedy in the Death Star. Yeah. That's what I was attracted to. Yeah.
So that's the kind of thing that indicates, I think, where a lot of young Democrats are. They don't like this country. They view it as an evil empire. Ronnie Chang describing this as sort of joining the bad side by becoming an American. It's absolutely at odds with everything that we should be wanting from the next generation of Americans. And yet it seems so common on the left. Personally, I think that a lot of this was accelerated and driven by the reactions to Donald Trump's election and by the experience under COVID. That's why we're going to be talking about both of those topics today with our guests. But the truth is that it's something that's underlying a lot of the American experience going back almost half a century now. The steady decline of trust in institutions, our political institutions since Watergate, the military since the experiences that we had in Iraq, decline of faith in the church, the decline of faith in just public, and community institutions, the kind that used to be the guard against hating your neighbors over their politics, that now the "in this house we believe" sign is something that says, go away if you have a red hat, is something that we didn't used to have as an ideology in America, because we had the ability to sit down in pews across from each other every Sunday, or on the bleachers across from each other during kids' sports, or together watching games, at the local pub. And that was something that we could do together despite or even without bringing up the politics of the person who is sitting next to us or across from us. Today, that doesn't seem true. Instead, we have this feeling that things are rigged, and rigged not just against us, but against us and everyone that we care about, even including our sports teams. Let's do cut number 9.
The second pick will be made by the San Antonio Spurs, and that means that the number 1 pick in the 2025 NBA draft goes to the Dallas Mavericks.
There you get to hear the celebration of the worst front office in major sports, in my opinion, celebrating the fact that, oh, lo and behold, they trade away their superstar figure, Luka Doncic, to Los Angeles, even as the Lakers TV ratings were dipping. And oh, look, this just landed in our lap. The conversation all around this online among sports fans, even fans of teams that were not involved in the NBA lottery and did not expect to be top of choice when it came to the opportunity to draft consensus superstar Cooper Flagg, was all about the NBA is rigged. It's been rigged. It's been publicly rigged, and they're fine with it being rigged in the front offices with Adam Silver. And that's something that, frankly, is an idea that even some of the stars of the NBA have publicly entertained. Cut 11.
Listen, man, during the ball drop, during the lottery drop, Cleveland got the number 1 pick. I just don't think that was. What a coincidence!
Don't you see?
Wemby with the Spurs.
Oh my God! Let's keep LeBron home. You know what? Patrick Ewing to the Knicks. Derrick Rose to the Bulls. Like, I understand the assignment, guys. I had to make sure that I had to do my part.
LeBron James just doing his part. Of course, we're talking about sports, and that's less important than the big scheme of things when it comes to the impact that it has on people's lives. But there are other more important, arguably, areas as well where the faith in institutions that we have, including the tops of media, of politics, of government, those have also taken a severe hit, not just because of the financial crisis, not just because of the Iraq war, but more recently because we couldn't even have faith that the president of the United States was the president. Cut 12.
He was a train wreck. He was glassy-eyed. He had trouble following the conversation. He talked it hauntingly. Again, this is 2017, long before he ran for president in 2020. And I said after the event, thank goodness Joe Biden's out of office. Thank goodness he's no longer going to be in public life. And how could his family and his advisors possibly let him go on a book tour when he was in no position to be on a public stage? 2017. Now, I'm not a doctor. I know Joe Biden decently well, but I there are plenty of people who know him better. I couldn't believe he ran for president in 2020.
That's Mark Halperin from 2A. It's something that is an indictment, obviously, on the minds of a lot of people right now as we're getting these stories coming out of Alex Thompson and Jake Tapper's book about the entire cover-up that happened, about the president's state of health, his dealing with early onset senility, whatever you want to describe it as, the fact that he couldn't even recognize George Clooney. And that's the kind of thing that cuts to the core. Even if you have opposition on politics, on ideology, disagreements with your friends and neighbors, you still have to have faith in these institutions in America. And if you don't have faith in them, then there's going to be consequences that play out for generations to come. We need champions at this moment for truth, for justice, for the American way, to restore our faith in these institutions because they are important to sustaining this country that we love. Joining me now is John Rogers. He's a pollster at Cygnal, senior partner there, and this is the Cygnal that doesn't get people in trouble. It's a polling firm, a nationally recognized one here in the Washington area that does all sorts of research. John, thanks so much for taking the time to sit down with me today.
Ben, great to be with you.
So you gave me a lovely opportunity, and I've had it a couple of times in my life, but I appreciated it to ask a question in your national survey, and you do these of 1,500 likely voters nationally, and you reached out to me after we had a conversation a little bit about polling, and the question that I wanted to dig into was one that was related to just a number of anecdotal experiences that I've had, conversations with friends about losing friends since the 2024 elections. And I know that this happens occasionally in politics. Certainly there were friendships broken during the Tea Party and during the financial crisis. And certainly during COVID, there were people who went in opposite directions. There are families, that had tensions there. But just coming out of this 2024 election, I was curious about the actual numbers. And so you asked a question on this. Tell me a little bit about what you found.
Yeah, so we framed it up as asking, is it common among your social group, among your friends and neighbors, that someone ended a friendship because of the recent presidential election? And you had 53% of American voters overall say that it was common. You had 39% say that it was not common. But what was really interesting was the difference by ideology. And it's important to note, too, that this is self-described ideology. So at the end of the survey, we asked people, do you consider yourself to be a conservative, a moderate, a liberal? And self-described conservatives, it was only +4. 49% said it was common that somebody in their social group had ended a friendship because of the election. 45% said it was not common. But among self-described liberals, it was almost the complete opposite. It was +30. You had 61% who said that it was common that somebody in their social group had ended a friendship, and 31% say that it was not common. And then even when you digged deeper into the data, among Democratic women with a college degree, 67% said that it was common that somebody in their social circle had ended a friendship because of the recent election, +43, with only 24% saying that it was not common.
Man, college-educated women, you are willing to pull that trigger pretty fast, it seems like. So I'm curious, just in terms of the results here, did they surprise you? Because I know some pollsters, they have expectations about, how significant a question is going to be one way or the other, or demographics that might pop, on it. Was this something that was surprising to you?
It did surprise me. And what was really interesting was it was very heavily correlated by ideology, not even by partisanship, right? So if you were a moderate Democrat, you were much less likely to say that you knew somebody who had ended a friendship in your social circle over the election. But it was among what you would call the Democratic base, kind of the AOC liberals, kind of AOC personifying this, I think, in a lot of ways, who people said, yeah, I absolutely know people in my friend group who've ended a friendship over the recent election. And I think it speaks to the fact that there really are two different distinct Americas in a lot of ways. And you go and you see the data and how much it's changed, where even with Republicans and Democrats, especially conservatives and liberals, who say that they would be open to their son or daughter dating or marrying somebody from the opposite party. There's a huge gulf now that did not exist 30 years ago.
You, in fact, in citing the AOC example, you had voters under age 55 or +26 on this question versus voters over age 55 just +4, and urban voters +24% versus rural voters just +2. So basically, what you're describing here is a gap between people who define their friend group by politics and basically can't have anybody pull up to, the next wine book club meeting who has the wrong bumper sticker on their car versus people who are normal and well-adjusted.
If you're in a wealthy urban blue area, I think that describes it perfectly, that you don't want to associate. A lot of times, some of those voters, those highly educated female, very liberal voters, they don't want to associate with somebody who voted differently from them in the election. And I think part of it speaks to the increasing secularism on the left. And as that has happened, it's not across the board on the left, but as that has happened, I think that politics has become sort of almost a type of religion for certain voters on the left.
One other question that was in there was about race relations and the divide between the perceptions of college-educated women, as we're talking about, and black men stood out to me because the question was basically framed as, since the summer of Floyd, the last 5 years, have race relations gotten markedly worse, stayed the same, or gotten better? What is the demo that actually thinks that it's gotten worse the most?
Right. It's that kind of same group of the far left, college-educated white women, and then if you look at like black men, they're much more sanguine, I think, about how race relations are going in America at the moment.
The other factors in your poll, you obviously ask a ton of questions of the American likely voters. Just coming out of kind of the first 100 days of Trump's presidency, what's the status for both the perception of him and of Republicans more generally headed into the midterms?
Trump's image is remarkably stable. If you go back to January, so we do this national poll every single month, and if you went back to the January numbers, his image was a negative net 4, right? And it's the exact same in these numbers here in May. So his image is remarkably stable. What's interesting is his numbers have actually improved with union members, which is not too much of a surprise with all the tariffs that have gone on. His image is stable. Congressional Democrats, their net image is -9, so pretty underwater. This is one of the lowest points that we've seen the last couple of months. If you look back at the last 4 to 5 years for congressional Democrats, in comparison, congressional Republicans are at -1, so an 8-point difference between Dems and Republicans on the Hill. And among swing voters, it's really interesting. So among that crucial voting block of swing voters, congressional Republicans' image is dead even. Congressional Democrats' net image is -24 among swing voters.
So one thing in terms of a lesson to take away from this poll about the way that Republicans should be talking about the economy or talking about what they're doing, because what it really seems like is Republicans are pretty set, they're pretty steady, but Democrats haven't been able to pop up at all in terms of taking advantage of maybe any of the difficulties or any of the concerns that have emerged in the last couple of months.
I think congressional Republicans need to keep on focusing on the economy. When you looked at swing voters and we asked what their top priority was for Congress, 43% of swing voters said either inflation in the economy or cutting government spending and waste. 43%. Only 8% of swing voters said threats to democracy. And so Republicans need to continue to live right there and being able to say, we're going to bring prices down. We're going to continue to improve the economy, and let AOC go out there and talk about that she's fighting oligarchy. That's such an abstraction to most voters.
Last question for you, John. The immigration issue. Obviously, we talk about it a lot, here and across, other media networks and the like. These subjects are all very controversial. They've leaned into so hard, for instance, some of these deportations under, I believe, the idea that this is going to be able to peel away Hispanic voters or, have some kind of situation where they can take advantage. That doesn't seem to be in evidence in the numbers that you got in this poll data, which seems to show that a lot of these immigration policies are pretty popular with the American people.
They are. We asked about Garcia, the gentleman from Maryland, the man from Maryland, the neighbor from Maryland, as the left would say. And we just asked a straight up question and asked, do people think that he's should have been deported or should he be returned to the United States? And 47% of plurality said that they think that he should have been deported, and only 39% favor bringing him back to the United States. So it's +8 on the administration's position as it relates to Garcia, despite all the media furor over that. And Hispanics have actually swung towards the GOP on the generic congressional ballot since last month. So immigration right now is strongly favoring the Republican Party.
I lied. I do have one last question for you, which is just, John, among your friends and neighbors, has anyone ended a friendship over the 2024 election?
Ben, I'm originally from Alabama, so we take a pretty, we're pretty relaxed about politics, but my wife and I have lived in the D.C. area now for a couple of years, and, we do know people we know Republicans in this area who will just keep quiet about politics because they know that there could be some social backlash if people know that they voted for Trump.
Well, as a child of Mississippi, I will say, just, bless your heart. So thank you so much, John, for taking the opportunity giving me the opportunity, I should say, to ask this question. Really appreciate it. Look forward to tracking this kind of thing in the future. And thank you for coming on. John Rogers, Pollster and senior partner over at Cygnal. Thank you. I'm happy to be joined today by David Zweig. He is the author of An Abundance of Caution, American Schools, the Virus, and a Story of Bad Decisions. David, thank you for taking the time to join me today. I read your book with interest, even if it did give me a lot of PTSD. Do you find that to be the reaction from a lot of people who come up to you and talk about it?
Yeah, I think that's a pretty fair description. It's both troubling but necessary.
Mm-hmm. But it brings to mind things that I had taken out of my mind, especially things that Governor Cuomo did. I had forgotten about the mountain.
The foam mountain. Yes.
thing that is interesting about this book is that it's not actually a book about COVID. It's a book about institutions and decisions by policymakers and by leading figures, why they made them, and why they were wrong. And I wonder if when you started off, pulling together this record of something that had happened, having something definitive that you could look at and say, this is the things we need to remember about how this process played out. Did you know going into it that that's what the book was going to become?
I think I knew pretty early when I have a background in science journalism. I'm familiar with reading scholarly studies in journals. And very early when I started seeing empirical evidence that was running contrary to what we were being told in America, it became clear that this wasn't even about COVID, in a deeper sense, that this was about what I became fascinated by. How is it that the gears turn behind the scenes with these powerful institutions in our country? And during the pandemic, it's the public health institution, but it could be any number of different institutions. And in this instance, and in many others, how they interplay with the media, I think, is incredibly important. And so very quickly, I think it became apparent to me that the thing wasn't really about the thing, but it was about something more important and larger, to understand how these powerful sort of elite players and institutions in society, how narratives actually get formed within the culture.
Mm-hmm. There's so many elements of this that I want to touch on, but one that sticks out is pretty consistently is how quickly the plans that were in place before the pandemic about something like this were abandoned. People, I think, still have kind of a misimpression that there were no plans in place, that there wasn't preparation for something like this. In fact, as you detail, there was a lot of planning that was in place, but as you write in the book, everything was scrapped. You write in part, policy for American schools during the rest of the pandemic, from that 15 to the 45 point, the 15 days to slow the spread, would be one incredibly long improvisation. And I think that some of us started to understand that was going on, but a lot of people, I think, still don't understand. There were plans put in place for situations like this. They were just abandoned quickly. Why did that happen?
Right. So a big part of the early section of my book is kind of looking at, well, how did this thing start off? And you're right. I detail a lot about these, what I call government playbooks. These are plans made by the CDC. There was a big one in 2007 and then a revision in 2017 that explicitly were designed to give instructions on what to do during a pandemic. And the thing that's that's particularly troubling is these guidebooks, as I go into a lot of detail showing, were actually based on a lot of really, really poor data, that they're not great. But to make matters worse, not only were they not great, but we abandoned them anyway. We threw them out the window. And it's not because we threw them out the window and then acted more rationally. We went even further outside of what would make sense. So what I think the public doesn't understand is that the response to the pandemic in America, and in particular when you think about school closures, but all the sort of ancillary pieces related to that and just the broader restrictions, that these were simultaneously kind of winging it, these people, even though that's not the way it was described all the time, and that we sort of reached what I would call kind of an escape velocity from any sort of, when you think about it, what does an airplane pilot do when there's an emergency? They go back in their mind over what are the procedures I'm supposed to follow, or they open up that book. This is what you're supposed to do in an emergency, is you consult what you're supposed to do, the plans that were prepared in a sober time, not in the middle of the emergency. But the leaders of our pandemic, I would argue, panicked, and due to a lot of bad incentives, did not follow that course of action.
Mm-hmm. The way that things stand out is so significant. As you write, by early May, schools in the Netherlands, Norway, Finland, France, Switzerland, Germany, Spain, and more than a dozen other nations had opened. Most of the U.S., by contrast, stayed locked down, including the closure of the entire school system for some 50 million children, with the exception of a few districts in Montana and Wyoming, which would remain so through the rest of the academic year. Why did the U.S. take no lessons from Europe? Why were we anti the lessons from other nations, similar circumstances, taking lessons from what they were experiencing and applying it, especially in the form of reopening schools?
There are a number of reasons for this, and I view it as something that was just overdetermined, meaning that there were so many things going wrong in America in the pandemic and related to these sort of interventions that you're talking about. And what I view as kind of the original sin, if you will, was when it's both reasonable but wrong the way we closed schools initially, is how I would describe it. But what became unreasonable and wrong was when, as you noted, schools began opening at the end of April, beginning of May throughout Europe. And we're not talking about, a one-room schoolhouse in Albania. We're talking about millions of kids in school in countries and in states and in regions that had wildly different levels of virus prevalence. They had different levels of population density. They had all sorts of demographics. It didn't matter. They all reopened their schools, and what they determined, the EU education ministers met at the EU in May, and they said, look, we've observed 22 countries reopening schools here, and there is no negative consequence that we can see. They met a second time in June, had the same determination. I want your listeners to just kind of pause on that for a moment. I mean, this is an extraordinary circumstance where you had millions of kids in school in Europe, and they saw, just empirically, there was no evidence that this was increasing transmission at all in the community or to teachers. And this was just ignored or waved away. And that's what I explore in the book, is like, how did this happen? And so very succinctly, there are a couple things that are at play. And unfortunately, the primary one is the uniquely acrimonious political environment that we have in America. And the people and then related to that, the dovetail is that people within the public health establishment tend to lean toward the left. There's lots of data on this, as well as people within what we might call like the legacy media establishment. So you had these two really important, influential institutions in American society with a very homogeneous political leaning. And Trump was so reviled, so viewed as such an odious and unserious figure that anything he said became completely radioactive. And that is a core part about what takes place. And I go into a lot of psychology and sociology in the book, and even philosophy, to try to explain this sort of mass kind of almost psychosis that occurred, this motivated reasoning where people were saying things that were just blatantly, manifestly untrue, but nevertheless saying them anyway. The media was going along with it with, giant New York Times articles without questioning any of these just overtly absurd statements that were being made. It was an extraordinary moment. It's almost like a psychological phenomena that occurred. And I'm trying with the book to create a record of what actually happened, because just touching on your point before, just the idea of like, well, they're kind of building the plane as they fly it. This became a very convenient narrative for them, Ben, where it's like this idea of like, well, there's no plans and we just have to go along and this is an emergency. Well, that's a very conveniently exculpatory way of describing your reaction, because then you never have to be held accountable. And it's like, oh, well, no one knows what's happening. It's chaos. And the point of the book is to show that that was manifestly false.
I was sitting at a stop sign the other day, and I saw a city worker emerge from their vehicle and carefully, a middle-aged guy, carefully put on a cloth mask.
In 2025?
Yes. Literally just 2 days ago, this happened outside, by the way. And And I just chuckled to myself because I had just been reading your book, obviously, to prepare for this. And you have, in here, even an analysis by the CDC itself of community masking evidence before the pandemic, in which the authors identified 10 randomized trials of community mask use, found no significant reduction in influenza transmission with the use of face masks. To make matters worse, Fauci and other officials encouraged cloth masks, which could be purchased on websites like Amazon or Etsy, or even made from T-shirts at home, which offered less protection than surgical masks. So this happens, and then at the same time, when Trump, as you note, when Trump is announcing the policies related to this, when he describes wearing a mask as voluntary and then says, I don't think I'm going to do it. The main takeaway from those institutions that you were just talking about is, well, whatever he's saying, we need to be doing the opposite because obviously he's just wrong about everything. So we have to be going in the opposite direction. And I just think that the mask thing is such a pure example of how crazy this got in terms of guidance, in terms of the lessons people were taking away from what they were hearing, and in terms of politics driving their interaction with whether they had to do something or whether that something had to be avoided at all costs.
Yeah, it's a great point. I mean, what I show in the book over and over again is that our intuitions are often wrong. And I'm sympathetic toward people, and perhaps your audience doesn't fall into this bucket largely, but let's be sympathetic toward people who would think, well, there's a piece of cloth in front of my face. Maybe that has some benefit. Or closing schools. Yeah, there's a bunch of kids with snotty noses. Shouldn't that have some benefit at all? But our intuitions about things that seem obvious are wrong all the time. And this is particularly so with medical interventions. Just things that seem like they're going to work don't actually work. And I give lots of examples of this, stuff with like sudden infant death syndrome, that we were told you're supposed to put a baby on their stomach. Well, sure, that makes sense. If they throw up, then it'll be safer. No, it turns out that wasn't any safer. Remember DARE, D-A-R-E, keep kids off of drugs. That was a failure. There's just so many of these things that might seem obvious. They might seem like they would work, but that's why we have science, because you have to test things to see when your intuitions are wrong. And the reality is, as you noted, and as I point out in the book, there was never any evidence that community mask mandates, let alone mask mandates in schools, were going to be effective. Moreover, there's an enormous amount of evidence that closing schools was never going to be effective. These interventions might work, Ben, for a very brief window, a week, maybe 2 weeks. But in intervention science, they know that people don't comply. If you're given 5 giant pills from your doctor and they give you a headache and make you nauseous, you're probably not going to continue taking them. They know a certain number of patients just won't comply. Well, it's the same thing with uncomfortable interventions. Human beings are not robots. They tested masks on mannequins and glued the mask to their face. This is part of what the CDC uses as justification. Of course, human beings, let alone a 3-year-old, does not keep a mask glued to their face. Similarly, I talk about cellular phone data in the book. People started moving about long before various restrictions were lifted. Why? Not because they're jerks, but because they're human beings, and that's what we do. Not to mention setting aside the huge portion of the population who are frontline workers who never were going to stay home. So the idea that closing schools was going to uniquely be beneficial, while kids still had to stay in daycare, younger children, while parents and others were moving about, kids were intermixing. They knew this in the academic literature, Ben, for years, that this stuff wasn't going to work, yet they did it anyway, number one. And number two, anyone who disagreed was vilified, was called a COVID denier. People like myself, I was writing in places like The Atlantic that are in the legacy media. It didn't matter. I was still viewed as a piece of garbage, even though all of the research was on my side and there was zero evidence that this stuff was going to work.
The dynamics at play between 2 points here. March 17th, Trump tweets out that we must flatten the curve of the spread of coronavirus, social distancing, closing schools, limiting non-essential businesses. So that's essentially where he is in March. By July, he's openly tweeting schools must open in the fall, and he's basically pressing back against this idea, realizing that the ramifications of this, and also seeing what's happening over in Europe and elsewhere in the Western world, that gives you some confidence that this needs to be something where people can get back to normal. What I'm curious about is what changed for the different institutions at play in between those two times that led them to have such opposition to reopening schools when it was clear that the American people, in large part, really did, want to get their kids back in schools. And we're starting to understand, I think, even at that point. I mean, I remember talking to parents, that summer saying, this seems to have been a mistake. We can see what's going on around the world. There were a lot of Americans, apolitical Americans, I would say, who basically said this is something that needs to change, and we can't just keep having these kids, trapped at home all day. It's hurting their learning. It's hurting their ability to communicate. And I'll say just personal anecdote. My wife was pregnant during the pandemic, and we had our first, and the difference between her now, because we made a huge effort to have her socialize young, and some of the other kids in her class is notable. Meaning you've got a class of 4 and 5-year-olds, and a lot of them, are just less talkative, less communicative. They're not as used to socializing, in part because of this, and their own parents will say that this is the reason why.
Yeah, you touched on a lot there. So we can get to it. The harms to kids around America. Remember, 50 million kids were prevented from going to school, and in certain parts of the country, California, Virginia, Maryland, parts of New York, and other areas, many kids didn't step foot into a classroom for more than a year. This is such a radical circumstance. Our country has not reckoned with it. There's a bit of like a memory hole here. Just think about that. Millions and millions of healthy kids barred from school for over a year, while at the same time, adults could go to a bar, could go to restaurants, casinos were open, people were out and about living their lives. This is a radical and extraordinary circumstance that happened in America, and somewhat uniquely harmful and almost malicious toward children, the way our country behaved. Yet it was couched in the language of safety and of care. There was something incredibly Orwellian about this. So when you touched on the idea of like, well, what happened with these institutions? And unfortunately, what I show in the book is that people's need to belong to their in-group and to vilify the other is so powerful, even among the ostensibly educated and credentialed class. It doesn't matter. That need overrode their sense of logic, their sense of ethics, their sense of following a scientific process. The American Academy of Pediatrics very early on put out statements saying, we need to get kids into school. This is incredibly important. Why did they say this? Because it was freaking obvious, right? And they're supposed to care about kids. And they said, don't worry about 6 feet of distancing. If you can do 3 feet, that's good enough. There's no real evidence that the additional feet's going to make a difference or be, a net gain. It was unequivocal. After Trump tweeted, open the schools in the fall, in all caps with a bunch of exclamation points, the American Academy of Pediatrics almost immediately reversed its guidance. Gone was the idea of don't worry about 6 feet of distancing. Gone was the idea of no matter what, let's get the kids in school. What did they replace it with? Listen to the experts, and we need an enormous amount of money to make the school safe. And the other thing that happened was the co-authors of that statement. It was the 2 largest teachers unions in the country who were not co-authors of the first statement. So when you want to ask me about what happened, it's politics and it's tribalism. And the American medical and public health establishment in America let its own politics and tribalism harm America's children. And that's what my book is about. I bring receipts in great detail, show how this kind of sociological and political dynamic overrode a sense of fairness and a sense of actually following the evidence.
And just think about the two categories of people that you just were talking about. Teachers and pediatricians. Those are like the two categories that most Americans, prior to the pandemic at least, I don't know what the latest numbers are, they would say, oh yes, these are the people we trust the most with our kids. We trust the most to look out to them. And yet it turns around and one, you have the pediatricians basically affected by the politics of the situation. And also they're not epidemiologists. They're not the people who are experts in pandemics. They're just, following the same guidance that everybody else is trying to follow. And then you have the teachers who basically turn around and have their own unions essentially say, we are holding your students' learning for ransom. You have to pay us off to the tune of a gigantic bucket of money that we're going to say that we're going to use to rebuild our air conditioning systems and set up these ridiculous, setups like are on the cover of your book, Abundance of Caution. And also, of course, you mentioned the 6 feet thing. You have a paragraph in your book about this, where the 6 feet thing comes from. That is one of the most infuriating, you clearly went down the rabbit hole of looking through all the footnotes and saying why did we get this thing that says 6 feet? And it's just it's maddening. Do you want to tell our listeners a little bit of what you found?
6 feet, there's nothing magical between 5 feet and 7 feet. This was made up. And I went down a bunch of different paths. I don't even know which one you're referring to. There's the
Carl Fluge, or however you say his name.
Yeah, there was a German researcher, supposedly, who had done some work back in the 1800s or something about how viral particles can flow in the air, and supposedly that matched up roughly with 6 feet. But I even hired a German scientist to look at Carl Fluge's original papers, and he said there's nothing in there about this. This was something, I forget, it was the Washington Post or somewhere, but they had printed that. But there's other stuff, Ben. There was a guy who said, this comes from the World Health Organization, from airplane data. And in my endnotes, I talk about that. I actually had a little diagram of it that my publisher sadly took out, where you could see the seats on the plane, where all this was made up. And what's so extraordinary, and to me, deeply kind of unmooring in a way, it is and this term gets thrown around a lot, but the sort of gaslighting that happened to the American people. And again, the vilification of regular people who have some common sense, who began to question some of these things. None of this is to say that COVID isn't real. None of this is to say that it wasn't dangerous to people and that people died from it. One of the big misconceptions when I hear this criticism of my book from some people, well, you know how many people died? I'm like, that's not relevant to what I'm discussing here. Whether it was 10,000 or 10 million in America, of which it was neither, that still doesn't mean that these interventions were going to be beneficial. And again, let's go back to implementation science. Things don't work on human beings over a long period of time unless we did a China-style welding people into their apartments, which we don't do in America. This was never going to be effective.
And in America, some redneck would figure out a way to get out.
Right. There's that too.
That's
exactly.
American innovation.
So it's just I approach this topic apolitically. I don't have an agenda. I wasn't trying to win, to score points. This was something completely insane happened. We had millions of kids in school in Europe. And then later, by the way, as you and your listeners know, throughout red states and red districts, kids were back in school. They were in school in private. So Gavin Newsom's kids, they could go to school in person, while millions of kids in California were not allowed in school. Why were his kids in school? Because they were in private school. It's very convenient. So none of these people actually believed what they were saying, I don't think, because they had their own kids in school. I talk about in the book the stuff Deborah Birx, she met with her family at Thanksgiving with multi-generations, even though she, wagged her finger at the rest of America. We weren't allowed to do that. One of the guys who made the models that we weren't supposed to do this, he went and saw his, he had an affair with some lady, not his wife, when he broke the sort of curfew and restrictions that he advocated for. These people didn't really believe what they were saying, or if they did believe it, the fact that they couldn't comply showed very quickly that no one was going to comply with this stuff, that none of this stuff was going to work, and tremendous harm came to kids. I know we're probably running out of time. There's a lot of focus on learning loss, rightfully so, but there are so many harms that you can't quantify. When you think about a poor kid in the Bronx whose football season was canceled, and he was counting on that as his ticket out of there. He was going to get a scholarship to college. What do you think happened to that kid's life trajectory now? We don't know. So there's so many kids, Ben, where we don't even know the harms and ways that their lives were damaged by shutting down the world to them.
Well, I mean, we've even gotten stories of, depression and suicide and things related to that in terms of being denied that. One more, you're just bringing things back to mind. I still remember the first time I saw footage of somebody running on the beach away from cops. and it was just very, but the one of the things that I also love the fact that you have the quote from Scott Gottlieb, the former FDA commissioner, about the 6 feet thing. He's doing his best, Nate Bargatze. Nobody knows. But one of the things that I do think we have to take away from this is, where is the accountability? Where is the ramifications of all the lessons taken away from the research and the work that you've done in this book, which I think is absolutely essential, and I'm so glad that it's getting the attention that it is, and that so many people have taken the time to interview you about it. Where is the accountability that makes sure that this doesn't happen the next time that something like this raises its head? Because I don't see it. I do not see, and I'm not talking about, you'll hear the people out at the political rallies and stuff saying, Anthony Fauci should be in jail or something like that. I'm not talking about accountability like that, though I do not like the way that he's profited from all of the bad decisions that he made. But the thing that I am talking about is, what do we take away as lessons from this experience that we apply via government policy now that ensures that we're not just winging it again the next time that there is something like a pandemic?
The whole reason I spent years working on this book was to address the exact thing you're talking about. And I'm similar to you. I'm not interested in people going to prison or stuff like that. What I am interested in is educating the public about what actually happened. That people, obviously we all were living through this, so we observed things going on, but I show the behind the scenes of how these decisions were actually made. And it's through that kind of what you almost would call a case study that I think we begin to have a sense, at least, that there might be some accountability moving forward. One of the most important things that I want people to come away with after they read the book is that they're going to have a different sense about how evidence works. We are told a lot of things as just regular citizens by the media, by politicians, by health experts and others. And again, this doesn't have to be about a pandemic. We're told lots of things, and more often than not, they are told to us through what's known as an argument from authority, which is, this is a logical fallacy in philosophy, which means that simply because of a person's credentials, we're supposed to believe what they say. Now, I'm not saying we're supposed to just dismiss something. If you go to the doctor and they say you need such and such a test, it doesn't mean, or you go to the mechanic, it doesn't mean, don't listen to them about your car. It doesn't mean ignoring the experts, but it does mean, particularly when we're talking about a radical intervention on the American public, it means demanding evidence, both in your own mind and possibly even publicly, going to a rally, writing into the New York Times, like talking to your school board, whatever the circumstance may be. That one of the things I show, and what they call in philosophy empiricism, which means empirical evidence is something that you can observe, something that you can see. And in our country, what happened was that the experts favored theory, where they said, well, we think this is going to happen, or sometimes they even further misrepresented things and said this will happen if we close the schools, or if you wear a mask, or if there's a barrier on your desk, or this other nonsense. If we do these things, there's going to be a benefit. That was based on theory. They didn't know that to be true. There was never any evidence, but yet the empirical evidence, the reality of millions of kids in school in Europe and then later millions of kids in school in America, that was somehow ignored. That is an astonishing sort of epistemological place for like a culture to be in, where you have the experts telling you, again, we go back to Orwell, they're telling you to not believe your own eyes. You know, it's interesting. There was the guy who ultimately took over at CNN toward the tail end of the pandemic. I think his name is Chris Licht. I talk about him in the book. He said one of the reasons why the viewership stopped listening and stopped trusting them was because they kept having the kind of hair on fire with the alarm bells ringing every second, and people looked out their window and that wasn't happening. They looked at their kids. Most of them had already had COVID. They were fine. So there's this disconnect that occurred between reality and between what we were told was the reality. And what I want people to come away with when they read the book is this like really strong sense of how those narratives get formed in the society. It will arm people with that sort of knowledge, whether you're at a cocktail party and you're talking with someone who disagrees with you, or whether in your own mind, for the next time something crazy happens, you're going to be prepared to understand what's going on.
David Zweig's book is An Abundance of Caution, American Schools, the Virus, and a Story of Bad Decisions. It is fundamentally a story about trust, about institutions, and what happens when we respond to things with our hair on fire instead of thinking about things soberly. David, thank you so much. This book is indispensable, as Nate Silver has called it, and I appreciate so much the work that you've put into it.
I really appreciate you having me on, Ben.
And we're back with Dylan and Christine for today's grab bag. First off, Dylan, I want to congratulate you on the performance of your Indiana Pacers.
Thank you.
Finally in the finals.
It's been a good week.
It has been a very good week for you. But I do have to ask, just as someone who is paying attention to the NBA in general, what was your reaction when you saw the Dallas Mavericks suddenly, magically, 1.8% chance win the NBA lottery?
I think I had a similar reaction to that LeBron soundbite that we listened to earlier in the show. Just like, it's a bit too good to be true.
Yes.
That they flip Luka, and it's like, the Lakers have a ratings problem. Let's get Luka to LA, and then let's pay the Mavs back with Cooper Flag.
Yeah, here you get a new white guy.
Yeah, exactly.
who's in better shape.
Exactly.
And just for historical acknowledgement, 2010 LeBron signs with the Heat. 2011 the Cavs win the lottery with a 2.8% chance. 2011 Chris Paul traded to the Clippers. 2012 Pelicans win the lottery. Anthony Davis traded in 2019. Pelicans win the lottery again, and then now Luka and Cooper Flag is going to head to Dallas. So I mean, look. The NBA will never let something like the Buffalo Bills happen. You know, they will never let one of these small market teams have the kind of success that they might otherwise have. And I think that that's something that is just, a travesty. They absolutely need to be able to, allow some of this stuff to happen. And until they do, everyone, you, myself, who's watching is just going to say this is rigged. Pour one out for the poor Wizards. Christine, I know that you are paying close attention to the continuing Blake Lively stories. This week, I know that there was some news, some information related to this legal dispute with Justin Baldoni that involved Taylor Swift. Can you explain that to me? What's going on?
So Taylor Swift and Blake Lively are best friends. Well, hold on. Were best friends. I'm not sure they're really talking much these days. During the filming of Blake Lively's movie, Taylor had been, according to Blake, Taylor had been helping, rewrite scripts. And remember, her song, Tears Ricochet, is like the theme song of the movie.
Okay. Didn't know that, but good.
Yes. And Taylor had been involved with Ryan Reynolds and Blake Lively of rewriting some of the scripts. So I think she's getting subpoenaed because now she's involved. And Justin Baldoni's lawyers are saying, no, wait, she needs to come in. She needs to explain what happened here. And I think Taylor's lawyers are like, that is not happening.
What historically happens when you do something that Taylor Swift doesn't appreciate?
So that's it for Taylor and Blake. They're never ever getting back together. That's gonna
this is gonna hurt the ratings on Chiefs games so much.
But I just want to put out there, if Taylor is looking for a best friend, I'm a little older than her, but I will happily take that role.
And certainly not sucker into a lawsuit over a movie conflict with a co-star, I don't think.
No.
So, Dylan, I know that you are a gamer and that you have paid attention to this. Mm-hmm. The biggest blockbuster release of the past couple of weeks was this trailer for Grand Theft Auto 6.
Yes.
That is both incredible in terms of the reaction online that it's gotten, hundreds of millions of views and all these different reaction videos, but also depressing because you're not going to get to play that game for another year.
Yeah, it stinks, but I've been so excited for this, and as far as GTA 5 goes, the previous game in the franchise, I would say I was late to the party. That game came out when I was 12 years old.
Oh my gosh.
So
young.
I didn't play that game until it was already 4 or 5 years old, probably. But I wrote down some stats that it's the second best selling video game of all time, 210 million copies, $8.5 billion in worldwide revenue. And right now, a game that is over a decade old is still the 10th most played game on Steam.
One thing that I think is going to be incredible to watch, though, is the way that Hollywood responds to this, because they're going to have to move any movies that they have around this release date. If you want any guys to go and see the movie that you're releasing,
I will
don't
be locked.
do it in May.
Yeah, I'll be locked in my room.
But I do have to ask you this: do you think that trailer makes you want to move to Miami, or be scared of moving to Miami?
It makes me scared of moving to Miami. Yeah. No, it doesn't make me want to move to Miami, but
might end up in a swamp if you move down there. So, Christine, this Elizabeth Holmes news, I wanted to ask you about that. I thought that this was a joke at first. She's running it back? She's doing the same thing all over again?
Well, no, remember, she's in prison, so she is not doing that, but her baby daddy is doing a company very similar to something that Holmes has gone to prison for, because
a blood testing startup.
Don't you remember
designed to help you optimize your health.
Do we have an audience clip? Remember
before?
her one drop? I can't do the voice. that was terrible.
Good.
Was it? I'm usually terrible at imitation.
one drop.
But so I guess
can I relay a story to you about Elizabeth Holmes?
Do you know her?
She was sitting at a dinner with an enormous group of extremely wealthy older men at an event that was out in Sedona in Arizona. And my wife was sitting at the table. My wife, who I had not yet met at that point, she was sitting at a table with her, and she was talking about how, and this is something that she said in multiple interviews, how Spartan her life was. That I just have a mattress and a treadmill, in my condo. I don't believe in buying things and stuff like that. And she, my wife was listening to this for a while, and then she said, she got tired of it, and she said, look, I know that bag that you're holding there isn't released yet, and it's worth almost $80,000. So I don't really believe you.
She said that to her?
So I think that this was all about just fooling old rich men, right? Yes. I mean, that's the whole thing, and because they were all old, they were all smart, but they didn't know really anything about medical science. They were all like Henry Kissinger and George Shultz and things like that.
Oh, poor George Shultz. He was really invested in it.
Very, very much so. And so, look, just, man, you can't trust those low voice blondes, man.
Ben, you can't say that.
Well, I just did. Christine, I know that you had an adventure recently for Mother's Day. We talked about it last week, that you had a very special plan at the behest of your child and husband. How did that go?
Well, first, I have to apologize on air to my husband, because I believe last week You, Lucas, and I were talking about how this was my only gift, was going to Hershey.
Okay.
That
good.
is not true. He said he came home with some very nice earrings.
Oh, wonderful.
And he said, did you think I'm stupid? So I do have to apologize.
Okay,
But
apology
Hershey
noted.
didn't really go to plan. We got kicked out of our Airbnb.
Why?
We got to the Airbnb. It was my family and my husband's sister and her family. The basement was completely flooded, like a foot of water.
Oh, gosh.
So we called the owner thinking that was the right thing to do. And they said, just close the door. Don't worry about it. Go about your business. Close the door. Well, they forgot to tell us that they were going to send a plumber. So our kids are 12 and up. So we had set them up for pizza. Saturday night, we were going to the park Sunday. The four of us took an Uber to dinner.
Mm-hmm.
We're in dinner, like 20 minutes later, my daughter is calling, freaking out. There's a man at the door, and he won't stop knocking. Banging, hitting windows, trying to get in. So we figure out pretty quickly that it's probably the plumber. So we call the owner, and we say, listen, our kids are there. We're at dinner. We're going to cut the dinner. We're going to go home. Tell the plumber to please stop knocking. You're scaring our children. And at that point, the owner called the police on us.
Oh, my gosh.
For leaving our children unattended.
Your 12 and up children?
Yes.
Unattended?
Yes.
Are you kidding me?
There's no law, by the way, in Pennsylvania. There's no law.
That's insane.
It was
I mean,
maddening.
crazy.
It's not a toddler. This is, gosh, I was, I don't know about you, but we had babysitters who were, 10, 11 when I was growing up.
I was
all the time.
babysitting at like 12 years old.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
it gets
That's
worse.
crazy.
We get to the house. The cops are like, it's best you probably leave. We're like, absolutely, we're not staying here. We pack up. The poor kids, now it's like 10:30, 11 o'clock. The poor kids are like getting scared and nervous. And then the cop stops the four adults. And he's like, hey, he goes, I smell alcohol in your breath. None of you can go until I give field sobriety tests.
So this is just a wonderful trip.
Yeah,
Wonderful
so
Mother's Day trip.
immediately I'm
All
like,
around.
I'm out. I am out. I'm not driving. Luckily, we got it all resolved. We got a hotel, went to Hershey, kicked the butt out of Hershey on Sunday, had the best day. But boy, oh boy. I mean, literally, Ben, you'll start to realize, and Dylan knows this, wherever Cookie goes, there's drama. Always.
Christine,
Always.
I do not begrudge the officer in that situation. I'm sure you had some fun reactions to it.
Oh, yes.
Peace of her mind. So look, I think the lesson from this is, like I said, it's easy to poach eggs. just do that next time around.
Did you?
Of course I did. That's what I do every year. So anyway, far less threatening than anything involving a field sobriety test. You have been listening to The Big Ben Show. I'm Ben Dominant. You can email us, as always, at bigben@fox.com. We will be back next week with more to dive back into the fray.